question. I said on Twitter this morning that I thought our panel tonight was one of the best that my producer Corey has ever put together, so they've got a lot to live up to over the next hour. You will be listening to Paul Nowak, the new General Secretary of the TUC, Wendy Morton, Conservative MP for Aldridge-Brownhills, who was the Chief Whip in the government of Liz Truss, Diane Abbott is Labour MP for Hackney North and Stoke Newington and former Shadow Home Secretary, and Fraser is editor of The Spectator and a columnist for the Daily Telegraph. Now, lots that you could phone in about today. The ambulance strikes that have been taking place, the civil service strike that's also been announced today, vaccine misinformation by the Conservative MP Andrew Bridgen, Rishi Sunak confirming he's used private healthcare in the past, tax breaks for private schools, Iran's apparent intention to execute a British man who they claim is a spy in the next few days. But anything else, feel free to phone in about as well. 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850 and you can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And of course, you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's get straight on to our first caller. It's Jay in St Ives. Is that in Cornwall, Jay? I presume it is.
No, Cambridgeshire.
Cambridgeshire. I know, obviously I got it wrong. Right, what's your question?
Nice talking to you. Yeah, my question is to the panel. Bragging about being registered with a local NHS GP at today's PMQ, does it show Rishi Sunak is out of touch?
Why do you use the word bragging?
Because when he was asked a question about using an NHS dentist, he diverted the conversation and he said he's now registered with local GP.
Fraser Nelson.
Well, I guess this is about portraying Rishi Sunak as being so out of touch. As somebody as rich as him wouldn't have to use the NHS. Now, and he's been asked about it because he's dodged the question. He was asked, months ago, whether he uses the NHS. He says, no, that's not relevant to the question. He was asked again on the BBC last weekend, do you use the NHS? He refused to answer. So any politician who dodges a question repeatedly like that can be expected to kept being asked that question until he gives an answer, and now he finally has. So what people are saying now as well, has he just registered like yesterday with the NHS GP?
He's doing well if he has.
Oh, right.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And this is all part of the overall narrative that somebody, if he's too rich to be Prime Minister, he's out of touch. I really don't see it that way. I think no matter how much you use or don't use the NHS yourself, it doesn't matter if you're fit to govern a country. You've had people, like I remember when, the various politicians over the years have spoken about their own NHS. You get some politicians who are healthy and don't have to go to the NHS. It doesn't make them any less fit, I don't think, to do their job. So I don't think using the NHS makes somebody a better or worse minister. But that's a minority opinion.
I mean, this word bragging that Jay used, I watched it at lunchtime. It was quite a boisterous exchange, I suppose, but did you feel it was bragging in the normal sense of
this isn't
word?
the conversation he wants to talk about, so he's not bragging. But he had finally got an answer to that question, so perhaps he was happy he wouldn't be asked it again. But, there will be lots of follow-ups about his children, etc. Have they been seen privately, publicly? He doesn't want to get into that. He's quite a private person in many ways, and that's a problem because there's a great deal of interest. He, after all, is married to a woman who's richer than the king. Not very often you get anybody in Downing Street where the number 10 family is actually wealthier than the family in Buckingham Palace. So there is going to be a lot of interest that he'll have to get used to, I think.
Diane Abbott.
Well, to be fair to Rishi Sunak, probably the first and last time I do this on this show, but I was in the chamber and I heard him talking about how he's registered with an NHS GP, and I wouldn't say he was bragging. I would say that I'd be interested to know when he registered. He has dodged the question for the past few days. You remember Margaret Thatcher, and when this was put to her, she owned it. She said, I have the right to spend my money how I like, to go to hospital when I want to. Now, I don't
the doctor I want on the day I want,
exactly.
I think was the phrase she used.
And he might, because everybody knows that a billionaire family isn't going to, go to an NHS GP. He might have done better just to own it and then move on. What's happened? He's now been dogged by this question day after day.
Wendy Morton.
Well, I was in the chamber for PMQs. It was certainly a boisterous session.
Were you contributing to the boisterousness?
Well, of course. That's part of PMQs. But I think what Rishi did was provide some clarity, as others on the panel
Why didn't he
tonight
do
have
it
said.
with Laura Koonsberg, though?
Because he hadn't registered them, that's why.
Well, so I think it was important. The questions were going to keep coming, given the focus on the NHS. So we have got that clarity now, and so I'm pleased that he's done that. I think many people often are in a position where they can choose to go private or to use the NHS. And I think for those of us in politics, we know that people do ask questions. They do want to know, where did you go to school? Do you have an NHS doctor? The things that they sometimes feel they can relate to. But I think the one thing that I've learned over the years in politics is you do have to be true to yourself in these sort of questions. Otherwise, people continue to keep asking them.
I mean, Jay also used this phrase, it shows how out of touch he is. I mean, when you are as rich as he is it easy to stay in touch? I mean, how do you do that when you really don't have to worry where the next penny is coming from?
Well, look, I'm not in the same financial category, but I think for any politician, it's important that this thing about keeping in touch is making sure that you understand the people that you represent, and you can do that by, it's not just about where you register for a GP and things like that. It's actually having the ability to go out and talk to people, meet people, and understand what they're thinking, what's bothering them at any time. And that doesn't matter whether you're a wealthy MP or not. To me, that is the important part of being an MP, is understanding the people that you seek to serve.
But Wendy, I mean, I understand what you're saying, but there are a couple of things about Rishi. One is, it is a billionaire family, and they wouldn't necessarily have the experience that any of us on this panel would have with the NHS. The other thing, his father was a doctor. Yeah, you're buying
his mother
that.
Was a
it's an
pharmacist.
NHS
Well, it's a fact.
family.
It's a fact. It's a fact.
No, the point I was going to make was he's not been an MP for that long. And then he, was exalted and became Chancellor, and now he's Prime Minister. And whatever your income, if he'd been an MP for longer, he would have more of a sense about the importance of engaging with people.
OK. Paul Nowak?
Well, I watched that interview on Sunday and I was just flabbergasted that he just didn't come out and say it straight. I mean, everybody knows that he wasn't going to be going to a normal GP, and everybody knows he was going to be using private healthcare. So, as you say, why he didn't own it, I really don't understand. I mean, does this make a difference? I think it does, because I think ultimately, I mean, if you think about the crisis that has built up in our NHS, I think partly it's built up and it seems to have taken the government by surprise, because Rishi and other members of the cabinet aren't having that day-to-day experience. They're not.
But
they're not the people.
Are they?
But that's very different than your own lived experience. When you've got to get on the phone on Monday morning, 8 o'clock, and get in a queue to have an e-consult, never mind go and actually see a GP, that's very different. When you're ringing up 111 and you're waiting an hour and a half and you're told by people, well, it's actually good that somebody answered you within an hour and a half. I mean, that's the experience of millions of people up and down this country. And it doesn't matter whether it's our railways, our schools, our hospitals, a sense that a cabinet that isn't in touch with their own electorate, and isn't in touch, I would have thought, with particularly some of those voters in the Red Wall.
Follow-up question here. This anonymous text says, would we be better off with a Prime Minister that didn't go to a private school? This whole sort of private, bad, public good thing. I mean, you've both seen it in the Commons this afternoon with this debate on private education. Does this happen in any other country? I mean, most other countries, I mean, look, France, Germany, America, you accept that there is a state system and there is a private system. There doesn't seem to be this kind of debate, Wendy.
Well, I don't think it should matter where somebody is educated. Look, I proudly went to a comprehensive school. There was no other school to choose from. There was one. Parents, whoever they are...
Me too, by the way.
Excellent. Always do their best by their children. And I think in this country we're very, very
My
quick.
parents wanted to send me to a private school and I refused to go.
Well, there you go. There wasn't one anywhere near where I lived. But and it just wouldn't have been an option. But that doesn't matter. That's why I'm really passionate that we have the best education for every child, whatever school and options that they have. But I think it's very quick that we pigeonhole people based on what their education is and what their background is. It has to be surely about giving people opportunity, giving them support and choice and aspiration and hope for the future.
But it doesn't feel that opportunity is there for everybody, does it? I mean, 9 out of 10 people in this country are not educated privately, and that isn't reflected in the people who've been our prime ministers, who've sat around cabinet tables, and not only there, in our media, quite often in our boardrooms. That sense that it's disproportionately
not in this media. Diane, you wanted to come in.
Well, I think Wendy's right. I mean, the real issue is that everyone should have access to a high standard of education. I have to be honest, I sent my son to private school. So in a way, I shouldn't engage with this debate. But I'll also say I went to a state school. And what I want as a politician is that nobody should ever have to send their child to private school because the standard in the state system is so high.
But you did what you thought was right for your son, and every parent would applaud you for doing that.
Yes. The only other thing I was going to say is because you said, why is it such a big issue in Britain when it's not in France and Germany? I think, for whatever reason, private schools in this country carry almost a cultural connotation, which is what makes it such a heated issue. But of course, the main thing is, the ridiculous thing is that 9 out of 10 children go to state schools, and that should be the focus of policy.
Mm-hmm. Fraser?
And it's funny because in Britain it's about class, really. We're obsessed about class as a country. So, I guess I could say that Diane Abbott, she's out of touch because she sent her son to a private school. People do talk in that way. I completely wouldn't go along with that. I think it's ridiculous. And I think it's something like 17% of sixth formers go to private schools. It's actually a reasonably big high. And when you get to the post-GCSE standard, and it doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make the parents bad parents. People do what's best for their kids. And there are a lot of reasons to criticise Rishi Sunak, but I don't think the choices parents made for him in school, I don't think, it makes him a better or a worse person. And the politicians, for example, yes, of course, it's good to have experience of the NHS, but it's also, what about experience of the unemployment system? How many politicians have been on the dole? And we've got something like 5 million people in this country on benefits. Now, they're subjected to an often dysfunctional system, and yet a system overrun by politicians who've never been through it themselves. But then again, how many experiences can you expect politicians to go through to make them qualified to govern for other people? I think people want competence. And the funny thing about the voters in Britain is the voters really don't care one way or another. When you try to get this inverse snobbery whipped up, when you try to think, let's hate so-and-so, let's hate Rees-Mogg because he's posh, the voters don't really. They might dislike Rees-Mogg for a whole bunch of reasons, but this class envy is something more acute in Westminster than it is in the population.
Yeah, but Fraser, how many actual voters do you ever meet? I have to meet voters almost every day of the week because it's my job. And I have to tell you, amongst voters in Hackney, it's not so much class envy, but they do have a sense of who is living lives like them and who is living lives completely different.
But I had a caller from your constituency earlier on. Well, I assume she was Stoke Newington. I think that's in your patch, isn't it?
Stoke Newington.
And Tahira, and she said that she sent one of her children to a private school. She clearly wasn't a rich person. And I said to her, well, look, this policy that Labour have got, which would lead to an increase in school fees, nobody really knows by how much, but it would be a few £1,000s. Would you be able to afford that? And she said, no, I wouldn't. And I suspect you would have been in that position as well, maybe. I mean, you're not, as far as I know, from a money background. But, I mean, you might have been in that position where you couldn't send your son to the school that you wanted to because VAT had been put on school fees.
That is true.
So are you happy with this policy?
Like I say, I have to resolve from the discussion.
But I think
how can you resolve? This isn't rather important. This is I personally, I'd love to know your opinion on this. Should VAT be placed on school fees? It's difficult to be neutral about it.
Yeah, because it's about my son.
But
no. If he was at school, I wouldn't be asking you the question. But because he's an adult now, I think it's an entirely legitimate question for both of us to ask.
I have to resolve from this discussion.
I think there's also a point here we mustn't lose sight of, that there are those families for whom private education is is probably the only solution. There are serving members of the forces, for example, who travel overseas.
That was my case, by the way. The military paid for my education because my dad was posted abroad.
Yeah.
Now that might be how down eternity.
Great value for money, I'd say, as well.
I don't know, but everybody's got their own. But this is why I go against this binary posh versus non-posh. I mean, am I to be placed in the posh category because the government paid for my school?
Paul, you want to?
You're in the posh category because you're posh.
Let me be a minority
What
of
about
one.
your Sunday and how posh is he?
Come on.
Let me be in a minority of one on this, because I don't think it's a case of send your child to a private school, you're a bad parent or a bad person, and or you're posh or you're not posh. I don't think that's really important. And just to say, I didn't send my kids to private school, but we've got lots of union members who do work in private schools, and we've got lots of union members who do send their kids to private schools. For me, the question is whether or not I, as a taxpayer, and other taxpayers should be subsidising that and helping to fund that, and I don't think they should. That £1.7 billion, I would rather see focused on the education of the 90% of kids who are in our state schools. So, I don't want to get into the binary posh or non-posh, but I do think, Wendy, I know that there'll be military families. I've got friends who are in military families who went to boarding school. That's not the normal experience. And people send their kids to private schools. It's often a choice. It's a choice I personally don't think the taxpayer should support.
OK, right. We will move on now. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to ask the panel a question. You're listening to Cross Question. It's 18 minutes past 8.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
20 past 8 on LBC. We have Paul Nowak, the new General Secretary of the TUC. Have you had a calm first couple of weeks in the job,
It's been a
Paul?
breeze. It's been a breeze, Ian. But, obviously it's been a really challenging sort of start to the job. But in many ways, I'm really excited by the opportunity to make the case for trade unionism and to show the difference that unions make. So, it's been a bit of a whirlwind.
Wendy Morton is with us, Conservative MP for Aldridge-Brownhills and Chief Whip in the government of Liz Truss. Now, Wendy, you were telling my colleague earlier on this is your first time on LBC because, of course, being a whip, you can't really speak in public very much. So how are you finding the experience so far?
I'm really enjoying it. It's quite liberating, actually.
Do you feel you've got your voice back?
Yeah, and I think I was fortunate to be a junior whip and then a minister for then chief whip for probably about 6 years in total. So you have a lot more freedom from the back benches. So I'm decided, I will come out and come on the show, and I'm really enjoying it.
Good. Diane Abbott is an old hand at this show. You've been on several times. Thank you for being with us as well. And Fraser Nelson, editor of The Spectator and columnist for the Daily Telegraph. Right, let's move on to another caller. It's Edward in Abingdon. Hello, Edward.
Hi, I just wanted to find out, does the panel believe that the country can afford double-digit percentage rise in salaries for the public sector workers?
Paul?
I think, Edward, that the country can definitely afford decent pay rises for public sector workers, and I think it's important that they do. We've got 133,000 vacancies in our NHS at the moment, a staffing crisis, and you're not going to help that staffing crisis by holding down the pay or, in fact, imposing a real terms pay cut on nurses and paramedics. So I think politics is all about choices, and I think the government's got some clear choices in front of it. But yeah, absolutely, I think the country could afford a decent pay rise for public sector workers.
Double digit?
Well, I think that would be absolutely legitimate and right. We've had 10 years now of wage stagnation in the public sector. In real terms, a nurse is £4,000 a year worse off than they would have been if their wages would have rose in line with inflation since 2008. So we've got to solve this crisis, and pay's got to be part of the solution, and decent pay rises, not just this year but into the future, got to be part of it.
When you look at the state of the public finances, though, can a double-digit rise be justified from that point of view? I completely get the inflation argument. I mean, but it sort of harks back to my first political memories in the 1970s when you had inflation chased by pay rises, chased by inflation, and it was a never-ending circle.
Well, that isn't the case at the moment. There is no evidence whatsoever, and Rishi Sunak, when he was Chancellor, got up in front of the House of Commons and said there was no evidence at all that it was wages that was driving inflation in this country. I would ask, can we afford this crisis in our NHS? Can we afford the crisis in our schools? And pay has got to be part of the solution. And, you know, at the TUC, we've set out what the government could do. It could choose to tax wealth in the same way it taxes incomes. It could choose to impose heavier taxes on the oil and gas giants. It's chosen not to. They are political choices. And ultimately, I want to see those nurses, those paramedics who I was on the picket line with today and who are literally at their wits' end, not knowing whether or not they can pay their bills, I want to see them get a decent pay rise.
Wendy, Brexit was in part about a high-wage economy. What's happened?
Well, look, we do need to find a way through the strike action that the country faces. We've got a situation. I was rail minister for a while, so I know the rail strike issue from my time there. You know, the strikes are really impacting on families, people trying to get to work, in some cases students, young people getting to school as well. So we've got to find a way through this. But, you know, to your point about inflation and affordability, we do need to, they do deserve a decent pay rise, absolutely. And, you know, in recognition of the work that they do, but equally it has to be affordable. Whatever we do has to be affordable to the tax-paying British
But you can understand
person.
when people look at the money that was thrown at furlough during COVID, they think, well, if it can happen there, why can't it happen here? Because it's quite clear that they're not just nurses, but there are plenty of other people in the economy who don't get mentioned in the headlines. I mean, I always mention prison officers who are vastly underpaid for the job that they do. But I mean,
I don't see that you can,
as Paul says, government is to choose.
We do have choices, but we also have to balance choices also against affordability and affordability to the taxpayer. And I don't think it's right to compare furlough with where we're at the moment. Furlough was something very unique. It was the right thing to do during COVID to get us through that very difficult time, covering both the public sector and the private sector. I just, really would urge all parties to actually think long and hard and seriously find a way through the situation that we find ourselves in.
Diane Abbott.
The question is, are we able to afford to see the numbers of nurses, junior doctors, care workers leaving those professions because they're not getting a decent salary? And it costs, if you can't get the nurses and the doctors, you have to pay agency staff. And that costs a great deal more. Now, double figures, yeah, the RCN talked about 19%, and they absolutely deserve 19%. However, anyone can see it's a negotiating position. And the problem has been up until now that the government has refused to negotiate negotiate. So can we afford to pay people a decent wage? We can't afford not to, because the cost of losing that staff and having to pay for agency workers, we can't afford that. It's wrong.
So that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because retention, particularly in the NHS, is a real problem at the moment, isn't it?
And you've got to pay them. You can't make people be nurses or doctors. You've got to pay them a decent wage, and the government has to face up to that.
Fraser, the pay review body recommended 5%. The nurses want 19%. Keir Starmer, in an interview at the weekend, would not commit himself to what the percentage should be. Inevitably, there's got to be some sort of compromise. Otherwise, it's going to go on forever and a day. Where do you think this is heading?
So far, the government isn't buckling, and that's quite significant. I mean, obviously, to me, it's obvious that 19% is unaffordable. If you look right now, we've got somebody's got to pay this money. Something like 2/3 of NHS costs are staff. Now, with pay settlements as tight as they are, the higher the staff costs go up, the less money there is for other health services. That was the argument that Mark Drayford, the Labour First Minister of Wales, used there, and I think it's quite obvious that when you've got a country which is taxed the highest that we've been in something like 77 years, it's pretty difficult to push that tax burden higher still. Now, people should be paid a fair wage. I think and of course, that leads to a conversation as what counts as a fair wage. One of the funny things about nurses' pay, for example, is that a good chunk of it comes in the form of pension contributions. And when you factor that in, I think the average package is just short of £50,000 a year.
No, come on, Fraser. You know what counts as a fair wage? A wage which means you don't have to go to food banks every week.
And your average nurse is not going to food banks.
Nurses are going to food banks. I'm not talking about. I'm not saying
the average is not. We're talking about.
I'm talking. No, a fair wage. It's a wage that means you don't have to go to food banks.
So what's
Partly
the average
because
nurse?
it's so humiliating.
But 27% of our hospitals have food banks for their own staff. Another 20% of hospitals are considering having food banks for their own staff. I've been a trade unionist for 30 years. I've never gone into a pay negotiation thinking that, this 19% is a complete red herring, that's going to be the point at which I settle.
Yeah.
I think everybody has been asking the government to get
Is that a realistic request then, Paul, would you say? Is 19% not realistic?
Well, I think it's a request made by the union reflecting... It's a request made by the union reflecting where their members were at. I think actually we've seen a little bit of optimism earlier this week. Stephen Barclay, for the first time, talking about maybe there's something we can do this year, looking at that. And I think there has to be, because the reality is those members working in our NHS, their bills are going up now. They're not going to wait until May or June this year. They're going up now. So I think it's really important the government shows some goodwill, which is what thousands of private sector employers up and down the country have done in response to union negotiations.
Fraser, is the Treasury the roadblock here? Because they often are in a lot of things. Obviously, if there are going to be higher settlements, the Treasury has got to come up with the money. But you hear from the rail sector, from the rail unions, and indeed the unions involved in the nurses and ambulance dispute, that there is progress, and then suddenly something else is put on the table from the government point of view, or a block is put on. Is it the Treasury that's causing these roadblocks?
Well, the Treasury's concern is if you basically wobble with an independent figure on one group of workers, and everybody else will ask for it too, then next thing you know, you've lost control of the whole process. But I think the room for compromise might be looking at, for example, like the extras which you get around your salary. Could you wrap that into the overall figure? What about, and to me, I think it's ridiculous how nurses are not given more power to take more of their remuneration as salary and less of it as pension. The idea that you've got to take 1/3 of your remuneration as pension is a pretty big ratio. Other than MPs, I
what it is?
I don't think it's not.
No,
it's not a 33% employer contribution, Fraser.
I'm not saying it's more contribution. But if you look at the figure, it's a pretty hefty chunk, bigger than you get in any private sector organisation. Between 20 and 30, anyway. I think the peer review body put it at that. Now, no nurse has got the power to say, you know what, I don't want this to get it when I'm 55. I need the money right now, and to be able to move the dial. Lots of private companies would let people do that if they wanted. I think nurses should be empowered more as to how much of the package they access in the way that they want.
They should be empowered to say, "Oh, I want to be poor when I'm old." Come on, Fraser.
No, not poor.
No, poor.
They've got the most generous pension settlement in this country, pretty much, nurses.
But let me me say this, just a small point, because you're going on about the 19%. It seems to me, possibly, could you never been an active trade unionist? You do not know the difference between a negotiating position and an absolute immovable demand.
But you could also say you undermine your negotiating position by asking for a ludicrous amount that you know you're not going to get.
No, you've got to start somewhere, Ian. You've got to start somewhere. That's what negotiation is about.
Right.
Yeah, but surely you started something that's not ridiculously high.
It's not ridiculous.
We could talk about this for the rest of the programme, but we're not going to. Our panel is... You're living up to my billing so far. So
Excellent.
Don't flag in the next half an hour.
The next 30 minutes.
It's 8:32. News headlines on LBC with Charlotte Morgan.
A Russian private military firm claims one of 2 British humanitarian workers who'd been reported missing in Ukraine have been found dead in the east of the country. Wagner Group forces say he was in possession of ID documents belonging to both UK citizens. 100,000 civil servants, including Border Force staff and driving examiners, have announced plans to strike on the 1st of February. A walkout by thousands of ambulance workers in England and Wales is also continuing until midnight. And Royal Mail is asking customers not to send anything abroad because of a cyber attack. The company says it's affecting all international deliveries. LBC weather, showers continuing for most, turning heavy in the south overnight with lows of -1.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
Paul Nowak, Wendy Morton, Diane Abbott and Fraser Nelson with us taking your calls. 0345 6060 973. Text question from Mary in Leicester. Andrew Bridgen's constituents are having to hope he now resigns from Parliament or they'll be stuck with him until the next election. Does this show we need more powers to remove bad MPs from their jobs? Now, you may not have caught up with this story. Andrew Bridgen's a Conservative MP and he tweeted something, very tasteless today at the very least, saying that he was quoting what he called a cardiologist, saying that the COVID vaccines have killed more people than the Holocaust. He's now had the whip suspended from him by the Conservative Chief Whip, Simon Hart. Wendy Morton, that would have been your job once upon a time. Would you have done the same thing?
I would. I think the Chief Whip took the right course of action. I think whilst Andrew has his views on this matter, I think the comments that he made on Twitter were wholly inappropriate and just really disappointing, actually, to see that.
I did slightly misquote him. He actually said it's the worst crime against humanity since the Holocaust.
There's no need for a comment like that. And I say, I know that he has certain views on the COVID vaccination, and some of my constituents, I know, share those views, but they're not the views that I have. But I don't see.
So just because you have a different view,
does that
merit the action?
What, of removal of the whip? Given the sensitivity of the topic, given what he tweeted, I do believe that the course of action was the right one to take.
Do you think he did it deliberately?
Well, only Andrew could answer that. Maybe he was being provocative. It's about judgment, isn't it? But I just, maintain that I would have done exactly what the current Chief Whip has done.
Now, Diane Abbott, you've been a bit of a nightmare for whips over the years. Do you think it was the right thing to do to withdraw the whip?
What I would say is I just really cannot bear this misinformation about COVID. I represent a part of London where I had groups, the black community, the ultra-Orthodox community. It was very hard to get them to be vaccinated. And this sort of rubbish circulating around reinforces it. So I genuinely feel strongly that people shouldn't be peddling nonsense about COVID vaccinations, and certainly MPs, whether Labour or Tories, shouldn't be doing it. But
the question, or the last bit of the question, was, does this show we need more powers to remove bad MPs from their jobs? Now, you can have a recall petition, but that's only a very sort of narrow set of circumstances, isn't it? I mean, should it apply here to this sort of thing?
Well, I mean, there is a power to remove MPs from their jobs, isn't it? And it comes at election time, actually. And, of course, as you say, you have recall petitions. So in between elections and so on, we have to look to the whips.
We might come on to that in a minute. Fraser.
It's difficult to tell if you meant it deliberately. I mean, when I first heard that, I thought, well, this is what Twitter does to you. Some people can think really stupid things. Now, normally, if you'd say it in Parliament, that would be a speech, somebody would talk you down. But Twitter can be an unfilter for people's worst ideas, and some of the worst ideas of Andrew Bridgen were pretty bad indeed. But he seems to have got himself stuck down the conspiracy theory rabbit hole. But you get quite a lot of that with vaccines. And I think sometimes, well, actually, one of the things I think is a shame that it's gone the way it is this will sort of play into the conspiracy theory. People say, oh, you see, he spoke the truth and then he had to kick out of his job. I think the way to deal with these conspiracy theories isn't to repress them or necessarily punish those who make them, but just to try to reason your way out of it. I mean, vaccines, especially the COVID vaccines, have been tested. So many millions of people all around the world. It is very, very difficult to find any rational reason to think as he thinks. And to me, I would prefer the discussion were on that rather than on, because sometimes you can see this online, somebody can question vaccine online, they can get shut down, YouTube takes a video down, and this makes things a lot worse.
Well, we had one of your columnists on yesterday, Lionel Shriver, who has some, shall we say, interesting views on this subject, and I couldn't quite believe what I was hearing, first of all. My screen went sort of ballistic after saying, you should have challenged her. So I then read out one of the texts, and it was quite a moment in some ways. Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I've got no truck at all with sort of the vaccine conspiracy theorists. I mean, for me, his biggest sin and why it was right that the whip was removed was because drawing any equivalence with the Holocaust is completely inappropriate.
Particularly in the Holocaust Memorial Month.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that absolutely, that alone justified the removal of the whip. But this is a pattern of behaviour from Andrew Bridgen, isn't it? I mean, I'll say it. I think he's a wrong 'un. I mean, he's just been suspended from the House in terms of not declaring his lobbying activities. He's had, I mean, I think maybe this is a wake-up call to Conservative Prime Ministers. I mean, he's had undue influence over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, frankly, more influence than he deserves. And I hope that the voters at the next election treat him with the contempt that he's showing.
Well, because he won't be able to stand at the next election if the whip isn't restored. Brief follow-up text here from John in Broadstairs, who says, should the system of whipping be abolished, Wendy Morton?
No. I mean, I think if we didn't... There are pros and cons to whipping, of course, but I think without the whipping system, I think getting legislation through that links in with a manifesto would be ever more problematic. But I think people sometimes don't maybe fully understand the whole whipping world, as it were, what the job entails and what it means. But there is that piece around, as a Conservative or a Labour, whatever party you stand on that manifesto.
And it can be very confusing, can't it, when you're whipping your MPs to vote one way and then suddenly a minister stands at the dispatch box and says, no, vote another way.
Well, I have a little bit of experience of that.
I hope you kept a diary that day and wrote down all the details for posterity.
I've got lots of notes in my head, so we'll have to wait and see
for the
on
memoirs.
That. Definitely, you might not believe everything I wrote.
Diane, I said earlier you've got. I imagine you've caused a few nightmares for some Labour whips over the years. Do you have a policy now, just voting how you want?
Oh yes, I've had that policy for years and years. I mean, of course.
Was it difficult when you were in the shadow cabinet, though?
Well, that was a brief interlude in my political career. No, I mean, the thing about whips is not the fact that they try and tell you how to vote, because they can't actually force you. I mean, obviously you'll have no career if you don't do what whips tell you, but that's your choice. The problem about whips is the amount of patronage they exercise, I'm afraid. Whether you get an office, what size the office is, whether you get leave to
attend... That's part of your job, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I would say, if all you're doing is trying to get people or telling people they have to vote with the government, that's one thing. But having been an MP for a few years, it's the patronage that whips exercise, which is a problem.
How big's your office?
Very big, because the whip...
You've just defeated your own argument.
No windows, but very big.
The whip at the time was Nick Brown, and Nick Brown and I were always friends, and that's why it was so remarkable. If it had been any other whip, Donald you or whatever, I still wouldn't have an office.
Let's move on to another text question from Shuvik in Eltham. What does the panel think about the renaming of a primary school in South London, which was previously named after Sir Francis Drake because of his links to slavery? Fraser.
I have to say, this just baffles me, this idea that we need to tear down statues, uproot our history, judge everybody by today's standards. And where would you stop there if you were to go and apply that to, you would end up, the Americans are answering that question right now. Where would this stop? Did you go after George Washington? Yeah. I mean, by the standards of the time, you can pretty much damn any major figure you want to if you want to find out, did they, in the 1700s or 1800s, hold today's views on race, on slavery. I mean, the funny thing about slavery, it was controversial absolutely nowhere in the planet until a bunch of English Christians started to kick off about it. It was a global institution, and I think to me, that is something which is really important to remember. Just how so many people, even some really, really, really kind, clever people who created the United States of America, didn't seem to bother them at the time. And I think the question, people should always remember that, so we can ask ourselves now, what is it now that our grandchildren are going to think is appalling, which we're doing right now? Every generation has got different moral standards, and every century will bring in the last century into disrepute. And when you lose track, or when you lose sight of this basic historical truth, I think you lose track of something very important about human nature.
What about the fact that parents at this school, I think I'm right in saying, voted for this to happen?
Again, I would not have given those parents the vote, personally, sorry.
Diane?
As you can all see, I'm a black woman. And for Fraser to have this kind of moral relativism, well, at the time, people didn't know it was wrong. They did know it was wrong. That's why people campaigned and organised to abolish slavery in the British Empire. So people knew it was wrong at the time. And as a black person, when people try and tell me, oh, why don't we honour all these slave owners? Because I don't want slave owners honoured. Full stop.
Was he a slave owner?
I've got absolutely no idea. I mean, quite often...
he made money out of slaves.
You don't find it like his uncle, he has small shareholding in a company. I mean, when people go down this archives, they can find out something you put in a footnote to a letter, etc. I mean...
Yeah, but you clearly, obviously don't see it like me. So, for instance, the church commissioners, because they made a lot of money out of South Sea Bubble, who traded in the slaves, they've put aside some money to try and to kind of make good the fact they made all that money from slavery. And people are criticising them. What are they saying? That slavery was a good thing? For goodness sake.
But are you saying that in Francis Drake's day, there were people around saying slavery is awful and we should abolish it? Was that a major thing in 1580?
Well, let me tell you, slaves were saying that.
Right, but you say... But
it is part of our history.
Yeah, a lot of
things... And where does it...
A lot of things are part of our history, Wendy. That doesn't make them things we should...
Let me put this to you, Wendy, because, Sir Francis Drake, I don't know much about him, but he's always been one of these people in history that I've always thought was a sort of British heroic figure. There are plenty of others. Even fairly recently, you say, General Montgomery, most people would say was a great British figure, and yet he held profoundly racist views. How far do we go in this?
But you can't erase history. We might not like what happens. Hindsight's a great thing, but I'm rather on the same page as Fraser here, in that if you start trying to erase things, where does it end? What we can do, though, Diane, is that it's right to learn from history, and what was deemed right at the time maybe isn't right now. But we can make that judgment. But otherwise, we'll be forever tearing things down, ripping things up, and then I think we lose not just the history, but we lose the learning as well.
Paul, you can't erase history, but it's right to question our history and right to question our interpretation of history and our presentation of history. And I think I'm with Diane. I don't know enough about Francis Drake, but actually I respect the views of the parents who clearly did take the time and effort to think about the issue and to vote on the issue, and they've made that decision. So I think, this isn't about somehow, sort of rewriting the past, but it is about saying that the interpretation of history that we're traditionally presented with is open to question and should be open to legitimate question.
And you can't erase history, Wendy, but sometimes...
I'm not saying to erase history.
No, but you can't erase history, but sometimes people turn around and say something is wrong. I bet you that there would have been statues to Adolf Hitler all across Germany. I bet you every single one has been taken down, because we can look at it and say Nazism was wrong, full stop. And people that say to me, we should have these statues of these slave owners, I have a problem with that. I really do.
Okay, right, let's move on. It's 8:48.
LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
Paul Nowak, Wendy Morton, Diane Abbott and Fraser Nelson with me answering your questions. Malcolm's in Bodmin. Hello, Malcolm.
Evening, Ian. Evening, panel.
Evening.
Hi.
Evening.
I have a very good question for the panel this evening. It is, does someone of Ken Clark's stature saying that he is relaxed about Keir Starmer and the Social Democrat Labour Party being in power show that Sunak is coasting towards defeat?
Always very helpful, Ken Clark, to the Tory party leadership. Now, he said this on Tonight with Andrew Marr on LBC this evening. This is what he said. It's probably time the Social Democrats had a turn and give us a rest. Wendy Morton, if he was still an MP, you'd be hauling him for an interview without coffee, wouldn't you?
Well, I'm not the whip now, and he's not an MP, so I'm not facing that question.
He has got the Conservative whip in the House of Lords, though, hasn't he?
Ken will say what he feels. He's in a position that he can do that. But I think to the point, I'm a Conservative. I'm a member of Parliament. It's not a view that I would share.
But do you? Because most elections are either about stick with nurse for fear of worse or let's do some hopey changey stuff. And the electorate sometimes can just get bored, and after 12 or 13 years, do you feel that's a risk now?
Look, we have been in power for 12, 13 years. I'd admit the polling's not great at the moment, but I still, the game is not over. And as a constituency MP, I was out the other week delivering leaflets and talking to some of my constituents. There's a lot of work to do. There's challenges that we absolutely have to face. I think the British public want to see more of the vision and hope and ambition that we have as a government, but also more of the detail of what we're doing to support families, businesses as well now to get through those challenges that we face.
Paul Nowak.
I think if you look at the polls, the British public agree with Ken Clark, and frankly, I think most people think an election can't come soon enough. I think. I think a Labour government, but a Labour government going into that election on a manifesto that reflects the issues that matter to working people for me, whether that's banning 0 hours contracts, banning fire and rehire, new fair pay agreements, a big wave of insourcing. This is the stuff that would make a tangible difference in people's lives. And I think, as I say, not often I would say I'm with Ken, but on this occasion I am.
But do you feel that he might be a bit too much Social Democrat rather than a bit red and tooth and claws?
No, I've just set out, Ian, some of the stuff that Labour is committed to that would make a big tangible difference to working people in this country, and I don't think we'd be in the midst of an ambulance dispute if we had Labour in power. I don't think we'd be in the midst of a rail dispute if we had Labour in power.
Who's paying for it all?
Well, the reality is the country is fed up and feels that we need a change, and I think Ken Clark's articulated that.
Fraser.
It's not just Ken Clark. We've had George Osborne himself giving his benediction to Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves recently, saying he'd think that they're highly competent, they'd be good at their job. You've had Claire Perry O'Neill, the former Tory Transport Minister, saying she's done with the Tory party. She's heaping praise on Keir Starmer. So you are getting, now some people might see this as Remainers, like Ken Clark, Osborne, etc. When he says Social Democrat, he really means Remainers, and there is a certain sort of Tory that always want to see the Brexiteer fail. Now that is a good target group for Keir Starmer. If I was him, I'd be going for these sort of Tories, saying, look, these Brexiteers, you knew they'd mess it up, Mr. Clark, so why don't you just back us Social Democrats, whatever he wants to call himself. But it is working, and I think, and I've just written the cover story for The Spectator on this, that it is no longer possible to demonise Keir Starmer as a terrible threat to the nation in the way that Jeremy Corbyn could be done. Red Ed Miliband and his coalition of chaos, etc. Now,
Talk about chaos, come on. We're in the midst of it.
But that is the point. Now, this was how Tory used to win an election, not by saying, vote for us, we're great, but the other guys are even worse. So vote for us to keep the other guys. This was a central Tory message and has been for a decade or more. Well, good luck to Rishi Sunak using that message at the next
Diane,
election.
briefly, if you can.
The thing which makes me believe the Tories are coasting towards defeat is the number of young and ambitious Tory MPs who are packing in and saying they're not going to run again, which suggests to me they think their party's going nowhere. Is Ken Clark right to say that it's time Labour had a go? Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm just laughing at a tweet that's come in saying, for Penny Mordaunt. Obviously, you're doing an impression of Penny Mordaunt tonight, Wendy. Who knew? Right, final call is Chris in Richmond. Chris, hi.
Evening panel, Ian. Do you agree that the right to strike has to be sacrosanct in a democracy, and that the government's anti-strike laws are abhorrent?
Well, I think I know, Paul, what your answer is to that, but give it anyway.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. I agree that everybody should have the right to strike, and I think a government that was really focused on the issues and on our NHS and on the rest of our public services would be trying to solve the symptoms, underlying reasons why people are taking strike action, rather than making it unlawful for striking workers to take that action. And let's just be clear what this law would mean if it went through. Somebody who voted in a lawful industrial action ballot could be forced to work, and if they don't work, they could be sacked. And I think the vast majority of the British public will be appalled by that, and I think the government should step back.
What about this minimum service level point? Because that is something that operates in a lot of other European countries.
It's completely disingenuous. I've had colleagues on from the European TUC and from different European unions today laughing out loud at the idea that this is commonplace across Europe. The reality is, in France, for example, you don't have to notify your employer that you're going to take strike action. Ballot your members, have a postal ballot, give notice. You just tell your employer, we are having a strike, and that's what happens. 95% of the public sector in France, of the economy in France, is covered by collective bargaining. And in Italy, where they have minimum service levels, if you refuse to apply those minimum service levels, workers can't be sacked. Grant Shapps won't give anybody that guarantee, and he won't give the guarantee for the very good reason that he knows that if people don't abide by these minimum service levels, they could find themselves out of work, and I think that's abhorrent.
I've got to ask the three of you to be quite brief on this. Wendy?
Look, when it comes to minimum service levels, I agree people do have the right to strike, but I think it's absolutely right the British public, workers, have an understanding and an expectation of minimum service levels and minimum safety levels. Otherwise, they're the very ones that actually can't get to work, can't go about doing what they need to do. And we find ourselves in a situation where, because of this ongoing industrial action, our economy is
it service or is it safety? Is it service or safety? Because safety, there wasn't an ambulance trust in the country that didn't have safety provisions in place today. Or is it service, which is it's economically inconvenient? There's a big difference.
Right, we've kind of run out of time, so I'm going to excuse the two of you from answering that question, so we can just fit in this final question from Mandy in Caterham, who says, a Kate Middleton lookalike says she's worried she'll lose work over the Harry Book row. But who do you get told you could get work as a lookalike of? Well, I'll kick off. Mick Lynch.
Peter Kay. Peter Kay I got from the fellow who cuts me hair. I didn't go back for months.
Can't see that myself. Oh, Wendy's obviously Penny Morton.
Absolutely, yes.
Why don't you grow the hair a bit?
True.
Diane?
Maybe Ella Fitzgerald, but I have to say I can't sing.
I'm not going to ask you to prove it, Fraser.
Voiceover from Lloyd Grossman.
Oh dear.
Oh yeah, I could kind of see that.
Who lives in the house like this?
Well, look, thank you very much indeed. Paul Nowak, Wendy Morton, Diane Abbott and Fraser Nelson. If we did regular panels, I think I'd all invite you back together as a regular. Maybe we will. Who knows? Coming up in the next hour on LBC, we're going to talk about ADHD, because we've got Peter Kay. Is it Peter Kay? I think it's Peter Kay. No, it's Johnny Vegas, because they look so similar. Johnny Vegas has been diagnosed with ADHD at the age of 52, as has the Middlesbrough Mayor, Andy Preston. Why does it take so long to diagnose people with ADHD? And what's it like living with ADHD? And what needs to be done to improve facilities for people with the condition? 0345 6060 973. That's the number you need to phone LBC.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, around 100,000 civil servants will stage a day of strike action next month in a row over pay and conditions. Border Force staff and driving examiners are among those who will walk out on February the 1st. The TUC's new General Secretary was on the picket line with ambulance workers today who are staging industrial action until midnight. Paul Nowak has told LBC's Cross Question the government can justify increasing wages.
The country can definitely afford decent pay rises for public sector workers, and I think it's important that they do. We've got 133,000 vacancies in our NHS at the moment, a staffing crisis, and you're not going to help that staffing crisis by holding down the pay or, in fact, imposing a real terms pay cut on nurses and paramedics. So I think politics is all about choices, and I think the government's got some clear choices in front of it. But yeah, absolutely, I think the country could afford a decent pay rise for public sector workers.
But former Chancellor Ken Clarke has told LBC the government says the pay rises being requested are unaffordable.
The two reasons for taking this hugely unpopular, tough stance, which I'm advocating, is they will help feed inflation. And the other, the government has got mountains of debt, thanks to the pandemic and furlough and all those things. And we're in a serious recession, thanks to Brexit and the pandemic.
A Russian private military firm claims one of 2 British humanitarian workers who'd been reported missing have been found dead in eastern Ukraine. Wagner Group forces say he was in possession of passports belonging to both missing UK citizens. A man in his 20s has been arrested on suspicion of murdering Ellie Edwards, who died after being shot on Christmas Eve. The 26-year-old was killed outside